All right, welcome back to the channel. I am here today, as promised, giving you a tier list update for July 2023. So we're about 6 months through the year, and I figured this is a good time to analyze the meta and reevaluate how I feel about some of the decks in the format. I do have some things that are going to be upgraded, and I also have some things that are going to be downgraded. So yeah, and we have like new stuff, the Giga Plant Ultimate Offering, crazy supervised decks. That wasn't a thing a couple months ago or when I did my last tier list, at least not as competitive as it could be now. So I definitely want to have a conversation about that. But there's a lot of things that have, I feel like, changed, and that's still so shocking to me because Edison format is a locked format, but yet innovations are still happening and things are still changing in a way that prevents it from being a stale format. So without further ado, let's just get into one of the hot topics I feel like I wanted to really talk about here is I think now officially I'm going to put Diva Hero in S tier. So this whole year, one of my very close friends, I've known him for over 15 years now. It might be even longer than that, but I've known him for a very long time. Cairo, aka a true hero. He's been showing that Diva Hero is definitely a very competitive deck, and not just competitive, but it is just good, like very, very, very good. It is as good as all of the other best decks, and it took a while to realize this because it had kind of fallen from grace in 2022. Like earlier in the year, it was really big, and then towards the later end, it was just Blackwing format for a long time. But this year showed that Miracle Fusion is like the card. I think that this is the year of Miracle Fusion for sure. There are so many decks that play it now, and it's being not, I can't even say it's being shoehorned into decks. It's just good. Diva here happens to be a deck that will OTK you with its Miracle Fusion. So whereas, the Frog deck, it doesn't really OTK with Miracle Fusion, just kind of uses it as another way to push its advantage and summon another absurd monster that has a lot of synergy with the deck. So it makes sense in there. But Diva Hero can kill you from 8,000. Diva Hero can establish boards that if you don't break everything in one turn, you lose because they hit you for so much life that by the time you retaliate, if you have anything in attack mode or you don't have a defensive card, you just lose the game. And that's actually a play style for that deck. So now that I feel like the deck is consistent enough, and there are also multiple people in the format topping with Diva Hero again, you have Beast Mode just top with it after picking a deck up literally without ever really playing it thoroughly. And he finished 7-1 in Swiss. And then there was another person, I believe, Ichigo Kurosaki was the name on edisonformat.com, but they also, both of them recently topped Deck Devastators 4 with Diva Hero. So there's a resurgence in this deck, and I know from personal experience that it is very scary, especially if you don't know how to properly play against it. And what I mean by that is how to side against it. I don't think that there are good side deck cards against Diva Hero. I really don't. I think every single card that you could side against Diva Hero is subjective on whether it's going to be good or terrible in any given game. So DD Crow, which is a common card that pretty much everyone side decks, DD Crow sometimes could be good, right? If your Diva Hero opponent decides to play their Miracle Fusions without actually considering that you might have Crow. But if a good Diva Hero player understands the format, understand what they're doing, they can set it up where you'll never be able to Crow their Miracle Fusion. So that's one of the problems I have with DD Crow in that matchup. Also, Malicious, if they special summon Greffer and use priority, you can't even DD Crow the Malicious in that case. And then the other thing is that if they send it off a Future Fusion, then you have to kind of Crow it preemptively, not even knowing if they have a card to convert off of it. So I really don't like DD Crow in that matchup. Pulling the rug is the same thing. So in theory, you hit Caius and Stratos and Diva, and all of those things are great. But if you draw it after the fact, it's awful. It doesn't do anything against actual Miracle Fusion. It doesn't do anything against Dark Arm Dragon. It doesn't do anything against Future Fusion or Return. So they come at you from so many different angles that it can make pulling the rug very awkward. Like, yeah, if you have it in your side deck, you probably should side it. It is one of the better cards to side against the deck, but it could also just be terrible at the same exact time. And it's not like other side deck cards for other decks, right? If you draw Consecrated Light against Blackwings, it's going to be good. The whole deck is just dark monsters. They don't really do anything to mitigate that outside of, deck devastation virus. And that's pretty much it. Like, Consecrated will actually do damage. Same thing with like cards like Royal Decree and stuff like that. They have a very high propensity to actually do what they're supposed to do. Whereas, again, a lot of the cards that you can side against Diva Hero just aren't very good. Like Soul Release, I don't really have a high opinion of that card in general. If your opponent decides to send the cards to the graveyard and in the same turn play their Miracle Fusion, then it's dead. So you don't really want Soul Release against Diva Hero either. Fossil Dyna, they have plenty of cards that can beat over even the Spine Gilman. Vanity's Fiend, same thing. Like there's just a lot of cards that in theory, like yes, these cards do hurt Diva Hero, but because of the way the deck is built and because it can win in so many weird different ways, none of the side deck cards against it are actually just guaranteed to work well. I think that in itself is a huge strength for the deck because a lot of the other decks that you're going to see in S tier and even in A tier, the side deck cards against them are very good. And speaking of decks that have really, really good side deck cards against them, let's see, Frogs. So you guys know, like I'm a big Frog player and everything, and this deck is always going to be S tier. It's just too ridiculous. The engine, thinning your deck out by, 8 to 10 cards. It has synergy with multiple other engines like Heroes, and Ronek's been recently playing the one with Gear Towns and stuff. That's also very powerful. Just straight Frog Monarchs is also ridiculous. Like I played that deck for a little while, and it's insane to just soul exchange people who went first and take their monster and use your substitute to go into a dupe block or a sub block. When they went first, it kind of is like you steal first place from them. So soul exchange is an insane card. We all complain about brain control. And if they played 3 soul exchange, just like they're just stealing your monsters constantly. And once they set up a dupe block, you can't retaliate. So the deck is really powerful. All versions of the deck are pretty decent. I think that Hero Frogs and the straight up just regular Frog Monarch decks, so far to me, those are like the best two just because of their consistency. They are designed to, the Hero one has a lot of good normal summons, like Stratos is the best normal summon in the format, Swap Frog, Substitute, Caius, all that stuff. And then the one that just plays a bunch of different Monarchs and like Dark Death Spear and Vanity's Fiend or Light and Darkness Dragon and Thestalos and all that stuff. That one is also extremely good because once it sees Treeborn Frog, it will just Monarch train you. That is what it's designed to do. It's going to summon a Monarch every single turn, and if you don't have constant stops for it, you're going to lose the game. It just blows you out really quickly. But then the problem with these decks is after game 1, which usually is free for the deck, games 2 and 3 become way, way worse. Every side deck card against Frogs is really good against Frogs. Mask Restrict, Fossil Dyna, Vanity's Fiend, Soul Release, DD Crow, you name it, like Skill Drain, Pulling a Rug, they're all good. Every single one of them is good. Any single one of them could win you the game against the Frog player at any given point. And like, sure, yeah, you could have a dead side deck card. Like I don't think DD Crow is necessarily great against the deck, but there are times when DD Crow is actually problematic. Like I've been Crow before in a spot where I'm pressured to do something like Miracle Fusion, for example, and I don't have 2 heroes, I don't have 2 waters. So it's like if they have Crow here, it actually sucks, and that is good when that happens. It doesn't happen often, obviously, because I'm trying to play around that, but I do think that the deck has a problem in games 2 and 3, and you do play more games 2 and 3 than you play game 1s. So just take that into consideration. I'll always have Frogs in S tier, but it is one of the decks that when people are blatantly siding for it, it kind of goes a little below S tier, like in games 2 and 3. I feel like it's definitely, no question, it might be the best deck in the format game 1, if we're being honest, right? Like it might be the S plus deck of the format game 1, and then after game 1 it goes down to like A tier. It doesn't drop crazy, but it just goes down to A tier, and it's like, all right, this deck is still insane, but now the cards they're going to put against you are going to be a bit ruinous. I want to talk about a deck that I am actually downgrading. So my opinion of pure fairies has definitely fallen off a lot. I don't think that this deck is actually S tier. I think that this is a bunch of cope. Fairies is just way too many normal summons, and the payoff is, Christia, but I really don't think that this is even the best Christia deck. Like I think that if your deck is like, I want to summon Christia, I think that just Christia Sworn is just a better version of doing that. And I've been saying this a lot to my group of friends that I talk to all the time, but sometimes the juice just isn't worth the squeeze. So everyone talks about, oh, fairies are so hard to play. Oh, fairies are so big brained. Oh, if you misplay with fairies, you lose and all this other stuff. And it's like, yeah, that's great, right? Like your deck is supposedly so hard to play and so skilled, and you feel so smart when you beat somebody with your fairy deck. But who gives a shit? Like at the end of the day, I just want to win. I'm not trying to like, prove that I'm this super smart player. I don't need to be the smartest player in the room to win any given event or any given tournament or to do well at any given event. And if that's your thing, if that's what you feel like you need to do to feel accomplished and to feel a sense of importance or success, then by all means, you can struggle with this deck and play it. But I think that not only given the current format where people are main decking Snowman Eater, which is a card that really hurts the fairy deck like a lot. It is very, very hard for fairies to get through Snowman Eaters. I really don't even know what they're supposed to do. Also, like DD Warrior Lady is your out to it, but then if the person plays it correctly, They will set Snowmeter once you have already committed a recruiter to the field, and then your DD War Lady is going to be used to banish the Snowmeter, but it'll have popped one of your recruiters. So it kind of just goes +1 on you in general. And then the deck can't really OTK anyone. And I don't like that. When people play against pure fairies, they know that they're going to get X number of turns, right? So if you're playing against Dragon Turbo, for example, like that deck is guaranteed to get X number of turns. There's nothing that you can do to really win the game fast against them. You can't really go crazy and just summon a bunch of monsters like some of the other S tier decks can and put them on really low life, or say you need to have Fader or Gores or wherever, or Tragodia. Fairies just don't have enough pressure in the first couple turns to win the game. But yeah, my biggest gripe with it is just how many normal summons it plays. It almost feels like a weaker version of the Monarch deck, because if I'm going to play a lot of normal summons, because Monarchs play a shit ton of normal summons, but they're ridiculous, like Caius, Junk Synchron, Stratos, Ryza, the list goes on. Those cards are insane, but just summoning Shining Angel or Dimensional Alchemist or DD War Lady, like yeah, in a grindy game where you guys are both grinding back and forth, those cards are fine. But when your opponent is doing the stuff that the S tier decks are doing, it's not fine. So that's like my issue with the deck and why I have decided to downgrade it to A tier. I genuinely do not feel that it is an S tier deck. I don't care who's playing it. You know, you could be as big brain as you want, but at the end of the day, the decks that are actually in the S tier, and you'll see all of them at the end of the video, of course, I think that they all deserve their placement because they do very unfair things and they do them pretty quickly. They create the most non-games. And I think that that's really what S tier is the decks that create non-games. I don't think Fairies really creates non-games outside of maybe drawing Dust Shoot, which is every deck that draws Dust Shoot can do that. So that's not really exclusive to the Fairy deck. Like, I don't feel like Fairies does anything that's like, this is a non-game. And I don't really care about people playing at a lower level. So, you know, someone who just summons a monster out and your opponent goes crash into it 4 times, drop Christia, and is like, all right, well, now you win. Like, sure, that happens against the shitty players, but at a high level, Fairies, people know how to play around the deck. People know how to make things miss timing. They know how to mess over your Dimensional Alchemist. People know how to not play directly into Christia, you know, not killing the fairy that you need, not playing in the Herald, stuff like that. Like making sure that your fairy count doesn't land exactly on 4 at the wrong times unless they already have an answer to the card, stuff like that. I think the counterplay to fairies isn't really difficult. And the other thing that makes this deck not as good to me is that the side deck for it is also brutal. Deck Devastation Virus is insane. It is the deck that gets hit the hardest out of every deck in the format by Deck Devastation Virus. Like there's no other deck that gets hit as hard by this, because the reality is frog decks can side out some of their low monsters, the monsters that would be hit by it, and still function. But fairies really can't do that. You can only side out so many, right? Like you're probably not taking out your heralds against certain matchups. You can't take out your Shining Angels and Nova Summoners. Your Dimensional Alchemists are needed. Your DD War Ladies are needed. Your Honest are going to be needed. There's just too many cards that you really can't side out in order for your deck to still function. So Deck Devastation Virus in any given game is just going to be a win condition, and the best decks happen to play Deck Devastation Virus either in their main or side. Like I know a True Hero mains the card, and then other people side the card. Some people side as many as 3 of it. So this deck is having a hard time, I think, in games 2 and 3. And then Light Mirror is also extremely good against the deck. They know Light Mirror is coming in, and they can have counterplay to Light Mirror, like Breaker and stuff like that. But there's not really a counterplay to Deck Devastation Virus. It's like if you get caught by that card, your hand needs to be 4 fairies and Christia, and you can just drop Christia, and that's like some super sacky thing to happen. Other than that, though, it's going to be pretty bad. So yeah, the side deck cards against this deck, and the fact that it's just a bit underpowered in terms of creating non-games. Okay, next up, I want to talk about dragons. So I had the dragon deck that plays traps as A tier in my last tier list, like a solid A tier. And recently, Fitz won Deck of Stages 4 with a dragon deck that plays traps. It doesn't play Mash Dragon. I always thought that card, like, I'm not a fan. I like the way his build is with the Snowman Eaters and the Card Trooper and all of these things that just kind of like be defensive until you explode. I really like that playstyle. It's kind of like the version of Diva Hero that Beast Mode is playing, where instead of going for like a hyper explosive, the gold Sarks and stuff like that, you're going for a more trap heavy lineup and trying to slow the game down so that the better player will win through making decisions, as opposed to just pushing really hard and being like, all right, you don't have shit. And if they do, you accept that you lost. And if they, you know, they don't, then you win. So I like that the dragon deck that Fitz built and played is a much slower, grindier version, because Dragon Turbo sucks. Like that deck is just not good. And the only thing about Dragon Turbo is that it can non-game people because it's a casino deck. But when it doesn't do that, you literally just sit there and lose the game to basically anything. This dragon deck is resilient. It actually is trying to duel, but it also has the unfair the unfairness of what dragons can do. So it does play Future Fusion, right? Like it does summon Red Met and Drago to stop your Gorzes and your Battle Faders and your Trags and all that. It does all of the broken things that dragons do, but it also does a bit more dueling when the hands aren't insane. You can just like wall up and sit behind Snowman or summon Debris Dragon and go for plays like that. So I like this version of the deck a lot. I'm not really sure if it's S tier, but I definitely think that it is either A tier, like high A tier, or could be S tier. That's kind of where I have it at right now. It's like could be S tier. Only one person has actually seen success with that version of it, obviously, right now. I want to see how this develops in the next couple months or so to see if more people pick it up, if it continues to see success. But I don't want to say just right off the bat, just recency bias, that it is an S tier deck now all of a sudden, because I don't fully believe that. So we will see what happens with this deck. But I do think that the Trap Dragon deck is genuinely very, very good. All right, I'm going to move Blackwings up. I don't really care the order of these decks, right? Like Diva Hero is not the best deck in the format, so don't look at this as though like, oh, Diva Hero is the third best deck. It's not. These decks are all just comparable in power, and that's how I honestly want you to look at all of the tiers. Is just that decks are comparable in their tier. So Blackwings, this deck needs no introduction from me. It creates a lot of non-games. It does a lot of unfair things. It plays all the best cards: Dark Arm, Trap Dust Shoot, Black Whirlwind, Colute, Blizzard. You name it. It can do everything. It's hyper aggressive, hyper defensive. It has comeback mechanics. Like everything about it is just really, really strong. And it's pretty much one of the mainstays of Edison format. When I think of Edison format, I definitely think of Blackwings, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. You guys already know how I feel about this deck. I think it is, out of all of the decks, I think it is the most consistent S tier deck as far as just like how unfair it is and how easy it is to do unfair things. Like you don't have to really be that good for Blackwings to be insane. It is one of the decks that requires the least amount of input for it to do its ridiculous thing. Like pretty much every game where a Whirlwind is seen in the first turn is a non-game, and that's just not okay because most of the other decks don't have stuff like that. And it's at 2, so it's not even like Future Fusion that's at 1, where Future Fusion and Dragons definitely is like a non-game kind of card or whatever. But Blackwings have 2 of their cards, so it's like their chances of opening with it are much higher than a lot of the other decks in the format. And you can just get run over. Also, I always think about this, but when I'm playing against Blackwings, or even when I'm playing with Blackwings, you always think like, there are so many cards in any given situation that if your opponent has it, you just lose on the spot. You can be like, yo, if he has this right here, I like a Blizzard right here is game, a Dark Arm right here is game, a Bora right here is game because of my life points and its monsters in defense mode, a Sirocco plus Gale, or a Sirocco plus Bora, or a Colute. Like there's so many things that can go wrong in any given moment. It's really scary how the deck pressures you so fast in the game. So yeah, anyways, I know a lot of people always want to talk about like, what do I think about Gravekeepers? Again, I don't really think that this is a playable deck really in Edison format. Like, sure, you can play it. I just don't think that it's worth it. Again, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. Royal Tribute is at 3 in the format, and yes, that card is absolutely insane. Don't get me wrong, but there's so many things missing from when I won with the deck, and people often try to get me to engage in like a discussion on how to build it and how to make it better in this format or whatever. I'm not interested. I pretty much avoid those conversations every time they're asked of me. Like, I just literally don't care because there's no point to try to force something. You're trying to shoehorn something into a format where it's not ready yet. Like when I won with it, it had duality, it had solemn warning, it had recruiter, and that by itself is already too much added power and consistency to the deck to make it insane. In this format, however, it's just like underpowered for everything else that's happening. I'm not a fan of the way Necro Valley works in this format. The fact that Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon can still activate his effect and bring back monsters from the graveyard, that's really bad. A lot of the things that it stops in other formats, they don't get stopped in Edison format. So look up Necro Valley in Edison format. It's actually just not even a crazy card like it is. Like, for example, Rekindling doesn't target. So Rekindling can be played under Necro Valley, and I am not a fan of that being allowed. Like, that is crazy to me that you can Rekindling under Necro Valley. Also, the fact that, you know, Flamvell is actually a deck in Edison format, whereas at the end of the year, you know, when Gravekeeper wins, Flamvell isn't really a deck in the format anymore. So even if Rekindling could be used under Necro Valley, it doesn't really matter because no one's playing that. And that's kind of the other thing too, is that, again, at the end of 2010, when Gravekeepers wins OICS, the format was so different that people weren't doing things like main decking Dust Tornado like that and all of that stuff. Like there's less back row hate in the main deck, and in Edison format, people main deck a lot of back row hate. Like there's the zombie decks play double Dust Tornado, Value Turbo plays Dust Tornadoes and stuff like that. So there's just a lot more back row hate, and that's not good for Gravekeepers because hitting your Necro Valley makes your deck really mid, like more mid than it already is. So yeah, for all of those reasons, I'm just gonna place this deck in C tier. I don't think that it's really playable. I would say that C tier is like it's borderline jank. You know, it's borderline jank type stuff. Like I'm just not a fan. I don't think it's good. I don't think it's worth it to play it. But by all means, if like you love the Gravekeeper deck, it is a deck that you can play in Edison format. So that's the great thing about Edison format is that you can just play it, but don't expect to beat Frogs consistently, or Diva Hero, or Blackwings, or Hero Bead, or Lightsworn, and all these other decks. Like, don't expect to actually beat those decks consistently because they're doing super unfair things. And like, you do have your one Royal Tribute thing that you can do, but you don't have Pot of Duality to see it more often. So there's that. So gadgets have had like a slight resurgence lately, and I think that most people just don't play this deck. Like I need to research how many people actually enter tournaments with gadgets, right? And then it also matters, unfortunately, like who they are, because if you're not very good, then it does show, even though gadgets have an extremely low ceiling. But I don't think the deck is like god awful. I think that the Ultimate Offering gadget deck with Solidarity and stuff like that is a deck that can be good if built correctly. And we've seen it at the in real life RBET. Like I think gadgets top that there might have been two of them in Top Cut. And that tournament had a lot of good players in it. So I don't know. I have a soft spot in my heart for gadgets. I think that the deck is not terrible, but I don't think that it's like insane either. Maybe I'll move it down to like B tier. I think that might be more accurate because it's not as good as like some of the stuff that I'm going to put in A tier. Perhaps it might be at the bottom of A tier if anything, but I do think that the deck is more viable than we all give it credit for. Like I personally know that when Gadget sees Solidarity, the game that they're playing is so different from anything else. It like 2000 normal summon monsters is crazy, especially when they replace themselves. It's basically Blackwings at that point with Whirlwind, right? Like all the Blackwings become gadgets with Whirlwind, but they have actual effects. And their attack stats are pretty high. So the gadgets being like 2000 plus attack, they beat every hero beat monster, they beat every Blackwing monster. It becomes very problematic really quickly. So that specific build of the deck, I really, really like. But I haven't really taken much time to try to break gadgets or really take it too seriously. And again, in this current meta where people are main decking Snowman Eater, it can be really awkward to play gadgets. So that's something to think about. Lightsworn, A tier, obviously. This deck is just really good. It's one of those decks that, so it could be S tier in any given game or match, and then it could just be like its regular A tier itself. I think it's always going to be A tier for me just because of consistency. Like when Lightsworn loses, it's always because of it just bricking on some of the cards that it wants to mill, and you drawing your cards in the opposite order. So you play Solar Recharge and you draw a Wolf and Necro Gardener, and then you mill Solar Recharge and charge, and it's like, okay, well, if that happened in the exact reverse order, and you drew the Solar Recharge and charge and milled the Wolf and the Necro Gardener, you absolutely win that game. So every time you draw your cards in the wrong order with this deck, it really, really hurts. And then when you draw the cards that you're meant to mill, cards that you don't really want to see in your hand, you don't see green cards at all. That's really bad too. Those hands are terrible in this deck. Like if you just see a hand of monsters, and it does play a lot of them, it's really bad. You need to see your green cards. You need to see your spell cards. So Lightsworn, really, really strong deck, really powerful deck. It was an A tier on my last tier list. I still have it as A tier here. Now, I think it's a deck that you always just have to consider when you go into any given tournament. It could just invalidate you, and that is one of its strengths. It kind of has a casino element to it, but I think that it does require more dueling than the typical casino decks. So there's that. Glad I'm going to put in B tier. So this deck, it's above like jank. It's above, you know, unplayable, which is what I consider C tier basically. But I will say it's just not good. I don't know what makes people compelled to play it so much. I guess there's nostalgia. I guess I do know, right? It's nostalgia. A lot of people remember Glad and Glory Days and all that stuff. And it's just one of those fan favorite decks. And I get that. I played Glad for a while back in the day, not in Edison format, but in the formats before where it was actually insane. It's just that I feel like you have so many things to choose from in this format that there's no reason to force Glad on yourself because you're just going to struggle a lot. If you misplay with the deck, it's very unforgiving. It kind of just loses to misplays. I was talking to McCabe about it literally last night at like 1 a.m. And we were talking about Glad, you know, it's not a terrible deck in the hands of a good player, but the problem is if anything goes wrong, it kind of just derails the whole game for you and you just lose on the spot. Like it's not even, it has no comeback mechanic is the thing. It doesn't have a really good comeback mechanic. Unless of course your opponent does something stupid to give you a comeback mechanic. But if you're playing against anyone competent, Glabbies don't have a comeback mechanic. They won't give you something to attack and tag out on. So once people play like that, it's just even harder for this deck to do well. And then again, the meta is kind of designed in a way to naturally shit on this deck. Like Hero Beat is everywhere. Okay, there are like multiple versions of Hero Beat, and all of them are a nightmare for Glabbies. I think, in my opinion, a 1900 monster is just basically an OTK against that deck. On top of that, Honest and Gemini Spark and Hero Blast, these are all cards that just make it hard for you to get an actual attack off. So yeah, without winning the die roll and opening up like Laquari set 4 or whatever, like I'm not really afraid of this deck. I think that it has way too many issues, way too much fragility to be considered above B tier. I don't really care how it's built. I more so just feel like the juice isn't worth the squeeze with this one. So Hero Beat, it was S tier last time. It is even more S tier this time. Like I think that Hero Beat, Diva Hero Beat, whatever, I don't really care to separate them out into 2 separate decks. Just Hero Beat in general. Decks that play multiple E-calls, multiple aliases, Stratos, and Mortar Monsters, Miracle Fusion. Those decks, all of them are S tier. They're just insane. The consistency, which is lacking from a lot of decks in Edison format, is not an issue for this deck. It has a high consistency because you play so many copies of Stratos. Again, the best normal summon in the entire format. You play so many of him that if you just, once you see Stratos, your game plan for the rest of the game is great now. Like no matter what happens, you've gotten the most important part out the way. You've established a pretty decent sized hero that searched out whatever you were missing, whether it was a water monster or just a beat stick to go with your Gemini Spark and Honest and Hero Blast. And it puts your opponents on a really fast clock. A lot of people don't realize how fast you lose the game to Hero Beat. Like 18 and 19 is almost half your life. And then if they do the have a level 4 monster, summon Diva, get Spine Gilman, synchro with the level 4 monster and a Diva, make Brionic, play Miracle Fusion. If they do that play, which is real, I know it sounds like I said a lot, but really all that is required is that they summon any level 4 monster and then it lives to see a turn. And then on the following turn, they summon Diva and play Miracle Fusion. So it's technically it's a 3-card combo, but it's not one turn. So it's really a 2-card combo once they have any level 4 monster in the field. But that is 7,900 damage with Brionic, the Spine Gilman, and the Absolute Zero. It is a lot. And it means that literally if an alias attacked over your Stratos and you took 100, you lose the game to that play. Like if I summon Stratos with my Hero Frog deck and they go summon alias, attack over it, and I take 100, I now have to be afraid of leaving that alias on the field if I don't have anything to stop damage, because that alias could turn into 7,900 damage on the next turn with just a normal summon and a spell card. So the deck is extremely fast, powerful, and it's why so many people are main decking cards like Snowman Eater and stuff like that. The meta has kind of risen up against it, as you saw in Deck Devastators 4. But yeah, that is one of the really strong things about Hero Beat, is that it's super consistent, it's very explosive, it has a fast clock, and it could side basically everything. I think that it's one of the stronger decks games 2 and 3. It can side Fossil Dyna, Mask or Restrict, DD Crow, Soul Release, Pulling the Rug, Light Mirror. Like there's so many cards that it can side. It can basically side anything. It even side Shadow Mirror sometimes, which is not terrible, funnily enough, against the decks that they sided against, like Value Turbo and stuff like that. Like it's actually not bad to have Shadow and Prison Mirror, because then Value can't be used, and like Greffer is a neg, Armageddon Knight is just a 1400 vanilla. So yeah, Hero Beat is great. You guys know how I feel about Quick Draw and Dandelion decks. Basically, I'm not the biggest fan. I think that they're better right now than they were before. So I guess I should take this time to talk about something real quick. The format right now is one where people aren't really playing Royal Oppression, and I think that's why I'm allowed to put things like Diva Hero in S tier. This deck had a problem when Blackwings and Value Turbo were literally like so much of the tournament, and everyone was playing them, and then the people playing it were really good players on top of that, and they were all maining Oppression. So Diva Hero has a very hard time in a format where Oppression is being mained in multiple decks. And right now, because of Hero Beat being one of the best decks and on everyone's radar, Oppression isn't that good in the main deck, which makes Diva Hero a much better deck. The same is true for, I would say, Quick Draw and decks that play Dandelion and Debris Dragon and all that stuff. I think that right now is a great time for these decks because Oppression is not being mained as much. So you're less likely to run into non-games when you go to activate, you know, Quick Draw, discard Dandelion or whatever, or you, same thing when you try to go into Deep Sea Diva or play Miracle Fusion and they just, you know, negate it and pay 800, and then oppression's still there. Like they went +1 on you after the interaction too. But now that oppression is just kind of out the format, not literally out of the format, there are still, like, you know, it's still played some decks. Value Turbo still mains at least one copy of it, sometimes two. But the Blackwing players aren't playing two anymore consistently. Hybrid Blackwings isn't seeing as much play. It's mostly people playing pure, and the pure build doesn't really go as hard on roll oppression. So all those factors basically help the Dandelion decks, the quick draw decks and stuff be a little bit better. I also think quick draw in general with its Rykos and Hamsters and Dandelions and Debris Dragons does pretty well against Hero Beat. Like I'm pretty sure that matchup is in the favor of the quick draw deck. The thing is, no one really plays the deck, so it's kind of like you don't really get to see that matchup often play out on streams or anything. But I think now is probably the best time you could possibly play a quick draw deck and get away with it. I think that while oppression is not really around, this is your chance. And it's a solid A-tier deck. It's decent enough to top a tournament. It could even potentially win. But yeah, that's where I'm going to put this one. So I have respect for all the cat decks. There's even cat plant decks too. One of them just made top 12 at Deck Stuff Stages 4, Maki. The plant cat decks and just cat decks in general, I think that they're decent enough to do well. I think that they're very grindy, but they're also proactive. So I like that. So whereas fairies, right? Fairies, my problem is that it's so reactive of a deck. You set your recruiters and you don't really pressure your opponent too much without them playing into it. Whereas cat is like, if you don't do stuff, they will just start ripping your hand apart, right? Like Arabellum is one of the cards that literally makes your opponent use irrational cards against it. Like if you summon an Arabellum, you're getting a torrential or mirror force response out of your opponent every time. That's extremely powerful in this format. The fact that your 1600 guy can force out some of the most powerful traps in a format, like he even gets solemn sometimes just because people really don't like having their hand touched. Like no one wants to have their hand touched on by Arabellum. Same is true with Reaper, but yeah, people don't want their hand touched. They'll use crazy cards to stop it from happening. So in that way, if your hand isn't good, it's just going to get ripped to shreds because you're kind of defenseless. And that makes the cat deck very powerful, on top of Rescue Cat itself being just an insane card. And then Pot of Avarice, Chaos Sorcerer, Caius, it plays all of those good cards. I think also Gravekeeper Spy is poised in a really good spot in the format right now because of Hero Beat. Like Spy is actually so good. The fact that it replaces itself, so it can't just be Jump Spark to get through it. 2000 Bud is really good. Descendant is also a decent card. I won't say he's like insane or anything like that, but like it does clear the way for your Arabellum potentially. It clears the way for your cat plays. It clears the way for Caius, and all of those things are extremely important in this format. So yeah, cat is actually also, in my opinion, poised really well because of Spy being good against Blackwings and Hero Beat, and those being like two of the most played decks in the format. I personally don't know where to put the fish decks. I know that they exist, but I don't see any results, and I don't see really many entrants in any given tournament with this deck. I don't really know what it's designed to do besides maybe Colossal Armory Arm, and I feel like if that was my goal, there might be better decks that do that also do other things. Like Diva Hero can Colossal Armory Arm pretty decently, and it's just a better deck overall. So I don't really know how good an OTK deck like the fish deck could be in this format. If there's something else that it can do, I'm just not privy to it, but I'm just going to put it in C tier down with Gravekeepers because I feel like the juice isn't worth the squeeze. Same is true for me for Macrocosmos decks. Macrocosmos in theory is an insane card. Like that and D-Fish are insane because all the things in S tier, they pretty much all get hurt by it in some way. Like even Blackwings does. Not being able to use Kalute, not being able to use Blizzard, Vayu, etc., Dark Arm being dead. Like there's a lot of things that it actually cuts off against all the decks in S tier. They get hurt by Macro and D-Fisher, but for some reason, it just doesn't perform well because of consistency issues. That's really what it is, right? Like you play, what, 3 Macrocosmos, 3 D-Fisher, or some combination of those 5 or whatever you play so many copies of the same card. And the problem is you only want to see one, and then you want to see additional copies equal to the number of times your opponent can remove it from the field. So for every MST or Ryko that your opponent has, you want to see an additional copy of Macro/D-Fisher. The problem is it doesn't line up like that, right? In a perfect world, every time your opponent gets rid of it, you're like, oh, I have another one, and then they're still under the thumb of having all their shit banished. The reality is you'll draw multiple D-Fishers, multiple Macrocosmos against an established field and have no way to deal with whatever threat is pushing your shit in, and that is problematic. It makes the deck super inconsistent. And so for me, it's like, yes, it's anti-meta, and anti-meta happens to be great against S-tier decks. But if the S-tier decks, one, if they draw their nut hands, they draw Heavy Storm, they draw just like their insane combo, or they win the die roll and they get set up. A lot of things can just go wrong where your Macrocosmos doesn't even do anything because your opponent went first and they already played Future Fusion. So that's already one Absolute Zero coming out. And then they have Miracle Fusion so they can play another Absolute Zero. He still gets his effect under D-Fisher, under Macro. So that's problematic. Same thing if you play against dragons and they Future Fusion you or just get set up early. They summon Red Eyes and just go crazy. It's like, yeah, my deck can't handle if you ever break through my Floodgate. 6 Sams, same thing. It's a deck that's just not ready for this format, to be frank. Like, it gets outrageous in 2011, but it's a full year before that in Edison time, and I don't think that this deck is worth it to play. If you're a 6 Samurai lover, then sure, again, same thing with like Glad Beasts and Gravekeepers and all that stuff. You can play it, but it is one of the worst decks in the format. Zombies, reluctantly, I have to keep them in S tier. I personally do not like this deck, but I always give it its respect. It is definitely one of the best decks in the format. It just performs too well, too consistently, and not even just to be results oriented. It does do something very unfair. Like, it is one of the best decks at OTKing you. It can OTK you from 8,000. If you've taken any damage, you taken one Kai's attack. 56 is a joke to this deck. It can just do so much. It also has natural anti-meta synergies in it. Like, it plays DD Crow, at least the list that have been topping recently. They main deck DD Crow. Not even just one. A lot of them play 2. And then they also play Book of Lives. I think that's really good for the format because a lot of the S tier decks are graveyard dependent in some way. So being able to manipulate graveyards is a big deal, especially as early as game 1. And the deck is really squishy. Like, it's hard to break through all the recruiters, the tomatoes, the pyramid turtles, and stuff like that. You always have to wonder if a face-down monster is Goblin Zombie or if it's a recruiter. You don't want to attack the recruiters, but you do want to get rid of the Goblin Zombie on the field because you don't want them to summon Diva or Plague Spreader or Caius. So it's a very awkward thing whenever they set a monster. This is the one deck that gives you anxiety whenever they set a monster. And in general, I typically hate setting monsters, but I think in Zombies is one of the decks that, like, yeah, setting monsters is totally fine. And it's really powerful in this deck because of what happens when you attack into just one. Whereas Fairies sets monsters too. Like, Fairies can set their recruiters, but my problem with that is even when you attack a Shining Angel, it's not the end of the world. It's like, okay, you get what, Dimension Alchemist or DD War Lady. It's not the end of the world. Whereas attacking to a zombie recruiter is probably just going to be game, or it's going to put them in a position that brings them so much closer to winning the game from that attack. I think Flamvell is A tier solidly. Again, right now in a format where Oppression is not seeing play and Spy is actually a good card, I think Flamvell, because it plays, you know, a lot of the cards that special summon, and it also plays Spies, and it has a 1900 guy in a format where Stratos is so frequently like the first turn summon of a lot of decks. This deck is poised pretty well right now. I think one of them top deck devastators 4, if I'm not mistaken. I think there's one in top 12. But yeah, I think Flamvell in general is just a very decent deck. It kind of gives me the same vibe as like the Cat deck. It doesn't rip your hand apart, but it does punish you. It punishes you for putting things on the field that you probably shouldn't have, in the sense that it steals them with mind control or it attacks over them with Fire Dog. And I feel like the side deck cards against it aren't really strong. Like, I'm not really sure what you even side deck against this, because Crow is not really good against it, to be honest. Rekindling summons as many as possible back. So if they have multiple things back, then your Crow can only stop one of them and the rest of them just come out. And it can probably side a lot of ignorant hate against decks. Like, I imagine this deck can side Mask or Restrict, Pulling a Rug, DD Crow, Soul Release, Light Mirror, Cyber Dragon, you know, all of the fixings. It can side like everything, and it's not really hurt by many things. So it's really strong, I feel like, games 2 and 3. The problem with it though is, again, Snowman Eater is in the main deck, and that can be very problematic attacking face down monsters. I think that right now, if I were to play Flamvell, I would have to check a face down monster with something else before I committed my Fire Dog to it. Then again, if you have Rekindling in your hand, it's not the worst thing for your Fire Dog to get popped that way. You rather that than to get banished by like a Caius follow-up or something. So in that regard, it's not the worst, but still, Snowman Eater is still less than ideal for you to see. It's still less than ideal for people to be main decking it right now. But even still, this deck is solid. I feel like X-Sabers are in that same category of like Gadgets and Glad Beasts, where yes, you can play it, yes, it can do cool shit, and it can pop off, and you can, you know, summon cat good and all that, and just like drop Voltrolls and rip people's hands. And but the problem is it lacks consistency. It kind of requires your opponent to not really understand the matchup too well. If people know how to attack properly into your Ember's Blades, and then how to force pressure on your Full Helm Knight so it doesn't actually stick, then you're going to have a problem. Also, people who know how to not give Full Helm Knight access to its effect to bring back a guy, and then not having a way to really quickly burst out 2 monsters on the field is problematic as well. Like, there's no quick way to get 2 things on the field outside of Rescue Cat. And that makes fall trolls not as good as they are in later formats. Literally, the format right after this, X-Sabers becomes one of the best decks, period. But in Edison format, it just doesn't have its Bogger Knight, it doesn't have Dark Soul, it doesn't have Poshul to go with Reinforced Truth. So it's just a little underpowered in this format. And I'm always afraid of it when I play it though. Like this deck does give me natural fear because I know what it is capable of doing. It's just that it's so inconsistent at doing it, but it doesn't make it any less scary. Neo-laris, I'm gonna say is B tier for a couple reasons. So I've been thinking about this a lot. Like what is wrong with this deck right now? And there are multiple things. I think that because Miracle Fusion is like the most played card outside of the staple type cards, or just like Deep Prison is the most played card in the format. Caius is like second or something. And the list goes down from there. Bottomless, Raikou, all the cards you can imagine. But then you get to a point where you realize that Miracle Fusion is being played by a lot of decks right now. And a lot of people who make top cut are playing it. A lot of people who are good players are playing Miracle Fusion decks. And that means that they have the best top deck in the format. So when we go into a top deck war, Miracle Fusion is crazy. On top of that, Frogs is kind of popular too. I don't think that Neo-laris has a particularly good matchup against Frogs because of obviously Treeborn Frog. Once Treeborn Frog is in a graveyard, then they can wall off a good amount of defense, and it could just top deck Monarchs after that and reversal you. Like I'm not opposed to a top deck situation if I have Treeborn and you just don't have something to really go hard on me, or even if you do, I just have a Caius or a Miracle Fusion or whatever. So it's a lot of the top decks of the other decks are pretty good right now. People side Crow still, like that's never going to change really. Like Crow will be inside decks, and when that happens, you lose. And overall, they're just better casino decks to play. Like I think Christia Sworn and Dragon Turbo are just better casino decks in general. But yeah, Neo-laris it's a fun deck. Like I actually enjoy playing with it because it's really quick Yu-Gi-Oh! You don't have to think too much. It's just like, all right, well, if this happens, it happens, and if it doesn't, then so be it. Another deck that I think could be S tier, I'm not really sure. I don't have enough experience to say with certainty. I know it's at least A tier though, is the Giga Plant Gemini deck with Supervise and Ultimate Offering and stuff like that. That deck is scary as hell. I've seen some of the feels that it creates. It looks a little bit too much like modern Yu-Gi-Oh! To me when I see it doing its thing. It's like that is way too many summons in one turn of monsters that are just huge, negates like Titanium and stuff like that. Black Boot Drago is insane. Like this deck is scary. It's very, very scary. It can explode on you. And then the crazy thing is like when it blows its load, it's not even fragile after that. Like the field that it puts up is actually pretty resilient to most things. So it's like, yo, if your opponent even has a response to it, it's not necessarily going to get them out of it. But yeah, I'm not sure where to definitively place it. So I'm going to put it in between S and A tier in that category, the same as the Trap Dragon deck. This is like just straight up Monarchs. So I'm going to put this in A tier. I know there are people who play Monarch decks that are not frog based. They're just like Hamster Raikos or Spies or whatever, and they play Monarchs that way, or like Dandelion and Quick Draw. I've seen all kinds of builds that just play a lot of Monarchs. I think that those decks are fine, right? Like Caius is always Hamster Raiko Caius or Spy, whatever. Those decks are always going to be decent enough, but they're just inferior to Frogs. Like that's just the reality of it. Like the Frog engine is insane. Volcanics, I'm gonna just say B tier because I don't really see it sticking with any of this stuff. Like this card is good. It is a 1900 monster that pops things. And honestly, right now, it could be like bottom of A tier because if Snowman Eater is being played, this card is really good into Snowman Eater because of what it searches. Like Blaze Accelerator, Discard Shell, pop your card is a pretty good interaction in general. And then if your opponent does destroy it, all of your rockets can just get back to Blaze Accelerator from the grave. I don't like that you can't attack that turn though. If I'm not mistaken, Blaze Accelerator says something like the turn you use this effect, you can't attack. And that is actually not okay. So Soul Exchange and Blaze Accelerator are pretty comparable. Soul Exchange removes a monster from your opponent. You can't attack that turn. But I think where Soul Exchange shines is that it establishes a pretty hefty size monster in the form of a Monarch or something. And that is a lot better than this 1900 monster that if Blaze Accelerator stays on the field, each additional copy of it is not that good because they don't have anything to actually search. They're just 1900 vanillas after you have your one Blaze Accelerator. So yeah, I'm not really sure where to place this. Like right now, theoretically, it could be at the bottom of A tier just because of a lot more defense being played. And I think that this card eats up set monsters in general, but I don't know. It's just not, it's not powerful enough. Maybe there's a build out there that is good for this guy to be played then in some kind of, volcanic deck, but I'm not really feeling it right now. Ancient Gears. So the only Ancient Gear deck that I really know of that's really good that I've seen so far has been Rawnax Frog Ancient Gear deck. I think that deck is genuinely good, but that's also because it plays the Frog engine. So it's like, yeah, I don't really know if Ancient Gears on its own is that good. Like without the Frog engine and just playing a dedicated Ancient Gear, not Ancient Gear deck, but a deck that plays Gear Towns and stuff. Because in my head, Gear Town is such an insane card. It's such an insane card, and then you get to play like Mausoleum or whatever field spell has synergy with it. And I think there's a lot of promise there. So I don't, just like the volcanic thing, I don't really know how to tier this one too well because no one has shown a really, really strong deck for Ancient Gears outside of maybe like KFC. But even that deck is just kind of mid. Like it's really like a B tier deck. Like sure, it can OTK you or do something crazy, but it's, you know, because of what it plays, all the cards that it plays in is inconsistent. That's kind of its issue. So I don't know. I feel like Ancient Gears has a lot of promise. I think that this deck could definitely move up a tier if the right build presents itself. Because when I watch people play with Gear Town and how crazy it is to summon a 3000 monster where battle traps don't work anymore for nothing, that is a very, very broken mechanic. Burn decks, not too much of a fan of. I don't really have a high opinion of Burn. Like you can play it and you might catch some people, but right now Dragons just won the last tournament with Prime Material Dragon in the main deck, so good luck to you because people like to play what recently did well, and this is definitely not the good time to play Burn. I would say not even just that, but I think people also know how to play against Burn. A lot of people side deck Road Decree, so yeah, not really a fan of straight up Burn decks. Value Turbo still S tier. My opinion of this deck is still extremely high. I think this deck is insane. It's the best oppression deck in the format. Everyone knows that by now. It plays some of the best cards. It's just a deck of good cards. And yeah, it rushes you down. It does so much damage so fast. That is its real strength, is that a lot of the hands can just OTK you from really high amounts. If you take in even as much as 1400 from an Armageddon Knight, it can do 6600 on the very next turn at like Greffer value. You know, like that could just be game between summoning a guy with Plague Spreader Zombie and activating Value's effect from grave. You can get overwhelmed really quickly. In the same way that leaving a level 4 monster against Hero Beat can get you killed is the same way I feel about Value Turbo. Leaving a monster in the field for that deck is really, really scary. This is the Amaryllis Plant Burn deck that plays Volcanic Counter. I still have a very high opinion of this deck, even though virtually no one plays it. I like it a lot. I think that it's just one of those decks that most people don't know how it functions. They look at it on paper and say, why would I play this? And I get that. I didn't think much of it either until I actually played with it and against it. And I realized, holy hell, this deck is genuinely good. But like, again, no representation whatsoever. So yeah. And then I would say also an S tier, and this is another deck that no one is playing. I don't know what happened, but Christia is an S tier deck. I think this is the type of deck that modern players would like to play because it's just non-game the deck. Like the entire deck is trying to non-game you. It's never trying to really duel, in my opinion. It's very strong against everything in S tier, like literally all the decks in S tier. This deck can be really good against because of it being able to open you up with the Hamster Raikou package. It plays 3 of each, and then Celestias and everything. And obviously playing 5 bombs and 2 JDs, triple Christia, Beckoning Light, all that stuff. It's a really, really, really powerful deck against everything in like everything here in S and A tier is probably weak to Christia Sworn. The thing is, this deck I feel like is a little bit more reliant on openings and die rolls than some of the other decks. Like if you open up with Hamster or Raikou and you go first, it's insane. But then when you go second, those cards are much worse unless you have Herald of Orange Light, because then your opponent gets to Caius you. And then the deck doesn't get to start. And it's this whole thing. It was like, okay, well, I didn't really get to play. I had to play a slower game. Again, this deck isn't really trying to duel, but it is consistent enough, and that's the scary thing. I have it in S tier because it is a consistent deck, and on top of that, it invalidates a lot of the other decks when it gets to play. Like Frogs do not want it with this deck at all. Neither do Zombies, neither does Diva Hero. This is a terrible matchup for all of those decks. Like literally, Christia Sworn is the deck that I'm glad that no one plays this deck. I am very happy that no one plays this deck while I'm playing Frogs because it is terrifying. And last but not least, I noticed that I don't have a spot for Dragon Turbo by itself. So I'll just say Dragon Turbo is going to be in B tier. I cannot accept a deck that literally doesn't care how good you are. It nerfs you if you're good. Like I feel like if you're a good player, playing Dragon Turbo is just a straight nerf to your skill. It is also non-game the deck, but it's less consistent than Christia Sworn by a lot. And even when it does what it's supposed to do, like when it does its nut draw thing and it goes through its whole deck, it can still lose. Like there are VODs and plenty of videos of this deck losing when it does pop off. So I feel like when Christia Swarm pops off, it's game. Like you just lose. Whereas when Dragon Turbo pops off, sure, it wins most of those games, but the fact that it kind of still has propensity to lose to certain things when it does pop off is annoying to me. Like a timely mind crush, stuff like that can really hurt it. Drawing your cards in the wrong order, all of that. But yeah, the bricks, I cannot with the bricks. Like the brick hands are so bad. I've tried to play this deck, and when you draw bad with it, it doesn't matter how good your opponent is or how bad your opponent is. They can just beat you. They will beat you. It's kind of embarrassing to just be attacked for like 3 or 4 turns straight, knowing that if you drew one card off the top of your deck right now, you would explode like crazy and you just don't see it. You keep drawing blue eyes or white stones or debris dragon or whatever, and it's like, God damn it, I just needed 1 cards of continents or 1 trade in, or I need to see my future fusion, and this game would be completely different. It's just not worth it to play it for me. And since it topped a long time ago, or I should say, since it premiered a long time ago last year, it hasn't really had crazy results because I think in general tournaments have gotten a bit harder. Like there are a lot more players who are now in Edison format who are good at the game, and also a lot of the good players just moved away from ever trying this deck again. So my opinion of this deck has always been relatively low. But yeah, so this is the tier list that I have. If you see a deck that you feel like is mid-tier, let me know in the comments. If you feel like there's a deck that I didn't bother to put on a tier list at all, also let me know of that. I tried to capture as much as I could. I did forget to put a picture for Dragon Turbo. I think it would have just been a picture of Super Rejuvenation, but I did tier that deck in my last tier list video, and I kind of just said like, yeah, it is one of those decks that's a casino deck, and I don't think it is even the best casino deck. So in my opinion, I don't know why I would ever run it. It's like I feel like Neo-laris and Dragon Turbo are in the same boat to me. But yeah, everything here, this is how I feel about where the format is right now. And I would love to hear what you guys think about where you feel certain decks are in the format right now. Also, I remember for this from last time, people said that I have too many decks in S tier, but like Edison is a format that fortunately a lot of decks are comparable. This isn't called Blackwing format. It's not called zombie format. It's not called frog format. It's called Edison format. And that's because there is no one deck that is so far ahead of everything else that there's no reason to even play anything else unless you're trying to cope. There are a lot of decks that are extremely powerful. All 7 of the decks that you see in S tier are outrageously powerful, and they're all comparable. They all can beat each other. That's the reality of it. All of them can beat each other, and they all kind of just like, some of them have good matchups against this and bad matchups against that. Side deck cards are good against this one, side deck cards are bad against this one, like etc. They all have their own thing. But I think that genuinely all of those decks, if I were to say for a competitive player, what should they be playing right now, it would be something in that top row. And yeah. Anyways, guys, I will catch you in the next one. Peace. All right, I was almost done, and then I realized that I didn't have anything for Machina Control, and I feel like Machina Control, even though no one is playing it right now, at least no one is doing well with it right now, the deck is still very viable. It's still very good, and it's an A tier deck. Again, any Hamster Reco Kai's deck, they're pretty much all in this tier. They're all decent enough and can top an event. We'll do it well at an event. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with this deck, but it's definitely dropped in popularity these last couple of months. It could also be said that because multiple decks are playing Deep Sea Diva and Spine Gilman, that Catastor is easy to access. And I remember when I played against Machina Control, I summoned a Catastor and the person had to go out of their way to get that thing off the field. It was a lot. So Catastor seems to be a really good wall and offense against this deck. And right now, multiple decks are playing ways to make Catastor easily. But other than that, like there's nothing really appalling about it or that would make it not competitive. It's still very competitive. I'm sure you could still absolutely get bodied by it. But yeah, that's just the thing I noticed after I finished this. I was like, oh wait, I don't have this Machina Control deck anywhere. So all right, I'm officially out. Bye.